Hello, hello, friends and comrades. Hello, friends and comrades. Welcome to the 12th episode of Dust James' weekly assault on U.S. empire. Those finding this through Facebook, you can see today's topic is going to be the power of the imperialist media. I was partly inspired to do today's show on the power of imperialist media from a quote that I made on Facebook 7 years ago. It's a little long-winded and wordy, but I think it really gets to the essence of what's going on. Indoctrination for conservation of a dying imperialist nation takes cancerous form, which infects all aspects of society and is forced hardest upon those who have the least to gain from it. I think I was mostly inspired to make that quote 7 years ago because of how horrible imperialist and racist Univision is. Um, like I was studying Marxism and revolutionary thought and Chicano nationalism, Pan Americanism, and I'd go to my friend's house, neighbors, where they would turn on Univision. It was nothing but straight attacks on any leftist leader, particularly on Hugo Chavez. Um, recently, not exactly recently, I think Donald Trump kicked out Jorge Ramos from something. I believe it was a racist move. Um, and then Jorge Ramos goes around and attacks, like viciously attacks Maduro. I mean, so it's like it's weird. It's weird coming at from a revolutionary perspective, especially a white person from a revolutionary perspective. If you attack people of color that are spouting imperialist media, a lot of people will say, "Oh, you're a racist," because you're coming from a reactionary standpoint. And for the majority of people that they come in contact with, yes, the majority of the people attacking people in the media and political and figures, people of color they look up to, they see as representing themselves. If you attack them, it's you largely from racism. But the truth is that our media is wholly controlled and consumed by imperialist propaganda and the standpoint of supporting U.S. hegemony and U.S. empire. Every person of color, every basically every movie made in the U.S. from Hollywood, um, all the television we watch is just littered, if not straight out paid by for the CIA and the military-industrial complex and recruitment wing of that. If it's not outright controlled and paid by them, it's 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 an expression of the dominant narrative, the imperialist narrative. Um, so, I mean, Immortal Technique, revolutionary hip hop artist, rapper, has a really good song, The Fourth Branch of the Government. And I'm not sure if that song or another song, he talks about how I think he's criticizing Fox News, and he talks about how like retired generals and people from the Pentagon are basically have a retirement home in Fox Media, which they call fair and balanced, and it's and it's funny. Um, there's a good song, hip hop by Dead Prez, another quality revolutionary rapper. He calls no, it's I think it's hip hop's the one song they do. But another one is Turn Off the Radio. And they have a section there, it goes radio programming, a figure of speech. Dead Prez is a really big inspiration on me. When he has a song called They Schools, And it's not talking bad about education. It's just how racist and classist the school system is. So I have a saying which I'd like to popularize. A lot of people like to say, "Not our president," referring to Trump, which is true. He doesn't represent the working class, especially minorities. He's racist against. But I like my saying, "Not our empire." Like the empire in general, all of it, both parties, the media, like everything that is them, it's them. I also like to say they empire. Like that's taken from kind of the vocabulary of Dead Prez. They schools, they empire. And another thing I like to say whenever I mention Bernie Sanders, I say even they best ain't shit. Um, I like to take large anti-imperialist concepts, break them down into common language. It's not. I mean, you can have whatever. I think your language should be directed whatever audience you're talking to in a genuine way, and you can talk the most academically, or you can speak, the common vernacular of what's going on. What's common language in your community? If you can genuinely adapt that to anti-imperialist message. Rebel Diaz is another good hip hop. I don't know why I'm mentioning revolutionary hip hop groups. I guess it's a fan of mine. But I think that goes into like when you think of imperialist media, you think of Fox News. Maybe you think of CNN and MSNBC, but it's bigger than Fox News and MSNBC. It's the entire music industry. It's the entire movie industry. Like, so in hip hop, you see on the radio, you see bad representations, even the more artful and soulful stuff isn't hard headed or even promotes militarism and joining the military. But it's even worse in country music. You see this like mainstream country music. There's a song "Proud to Be an American," just mindless, jingoist drivel. But there's also one thing I like to point out. There's actually anti-war and anti-imperialist sentiment in some underground and traditional country music. The people, I would say this about John Prine, which last I checked was in the hospital for conditions due to the coronavirus. John Prine, folk and country singer, has a song called "Your Flag Detail Won't Get You into Heaven Anymore." It's a powerful song. Heaven's already overcrowded from your dirty little war. Jesus don't like killing, no matter what the reasons for. That was a powerful song back in the day. It still resonates today. But you can find little pieces of vegetation or grass coming out of the cracks of the largely controlled media system. Another artist in that camp within country music would be Sturgill Simpson. Sturgill Simpson is very much an alternative and underground person in the country music scene. He's described himself as an anarchist. He's also a veteran, and that's a whole movement, anarchist veterans, going back to Fort Hood Disobeys, and other movements. I'm not even sure if he's aware of of like the history behind his sentiments. But he has a good song on his his current album, Sound and Fury, which is a rock album. It's very underground, and it has this very hard rock sound with a lot of synthesizer. It's actually dedicated to those victims of mindless brutality. It's still it's kind of like a music album on Netflix. Sound and Fury by Sturgill Simpson is a very powerful anti-war message, and it's actually dedicated to the victims of mindless violence. And if you look in the beginning, he also has a song called "Call to Arms," and that's his last song on his album Sailor's Guide to the Galaxy. No, not Sailor's Guide to Earth. Sailor Guide to Earth, which is a great album, and there's a lot of good stuff in that. And it's very hard hitting, about saying that the wars are for drugs and oil, and grandma can't even pay the bills. It's from a working class perspective. If you go even further back in Sturgill Simpson's career, he probably not want you to know this. I think he's trying to cover it up for legal rights or falling out. He had a group called Sunday Valley, and they do a song called Folded Flag. And on that song, he basically says they're going to call me a communist and they're going to call me a degenerate, but I control myself. They ain't going to control me. Very strong. And he talks, and he gets mad at like his community. A lot of people in the community, and generally goes, a bunch of rednecks watching CMT, country music television, is completely, the narrative on CMT is completely controlled by imperialist media, outright recruitment advertisements for the lead terrorist organization on earth, the U.S. military. So it's not just, I'm talking about little positive aspects, positive underground singers having anti-imperialist movements, from hip hop to country. But the idea is the entire media establishment, movies, televisions, nothing happens in a vacuum. All of these things that are produced by the big media corporations. First of all, media in this country is completely controlled. Like, I think there's 5 or 6 media conglomerates and outlets that control like 99 or 98% of what's consumed as media in this country. And the narrative is completely controlled. And it's not this news, it's everything. Movies, television, even NPR is basically our version of imperialist state media. You see this pointed out by, you actually see this pointed out by conservatives quite a bit, reactionaries, and they'll actually say some of the stuff that I'm saying. But my position is different from theirs. They're saying because they want a more reactionary, violent, like they're reacting to, this is what the current system says. So some imperialist media, it can be diverse, it can be representative, but it still has the purpose of keeping us in line with U.S. imperialism. And reactionaries will actually hit imperialist media from the right wing and from a reactionary perspective. And they'll say the liberal media, which is true. Liberalism, neoliberalism, and the Democrats is the main party and thing which U.S. imperialism, the more effective party in carrying out U.S. imperialism. But from an anti-imperialist perspective, it's also true. So I was going, even like sources, like more representative sources like BET, is run by Robert L. Johnson, which is basically a Trump supporter. Or let's get into politics. Like Barack Obama was unapologetically a representation of Wall Street and U.S. imperialism, destroyed the biggest country, destroyed the most prosperous country in Africa, carried out the coup in Honduras, which helped lead to the current migrant crisis on the border that Donald Trump has exacerbated. I remember watching a Spider-Man movie. Spider-Man's one of my favorite superheroes because he was working class. He was raised by his grandparents. He was geeky. Kind of wasn't the hero. The hero, like Superman's like this big, strong guy everybody looks up to, and Spider-Man was kind of like, I don't know, like the underdog that comes up, and still saves the world. And you can see how that story could appeal to a Marxist or a communist. But I remember watching, I think it was the second movie, where the Spider-Man gets up and there's a huge American flag behind him. If you notice, movies in general are largely militarized. Like they're almost like recruitment campaigns for U.S. imperialism. Um, like even when South Park is not independent, like they're glad, the US empire is glad when South Park mocks anti-imperialist countries, like recently with China. um, the US empire is pleased with that, you know. I mean, they barely, like, even the little bit of mocking of what they do of some right-wing politicians is mild in comparison to the attacks of what they do against anti-imperialist countries. Even Rick and Morty, um, is basically a represents. There's a lot of racism in it, um, and just it's a product of our racist imperialist society. Like every now and then you'll see a movie that has some themes, but even the most progressive media has great national chauvinism. The idea that somehow the U.S. is the best country in the world, which is an outright lie. All right. So, what are some good media sources? And NPR, even I would say even Democracy Now has a lot of great national chauvinism in it. They have this idea, the liberal notion that somehow the U.S. stands for peace and there was good U.S. presidents, and they repeat a lot of largely of bourgeois. It's good on domestic issues, um, but even Democracy Now will parrot attacks on anti-imperialist countries. So, what are some good media sources which I recommend? And basically, one of the leading voices from the anti-imperialist perspective would be Black Agenda Report. Glenn Ford, others, I think Abu, the Green Party candidate, um, Ajuma Baraka. Um, I had recently a book, Margaret Kimberly. I recommend this book, pre. It's hard to prejudicial prejudice and presidential. It's I think the title is mocking it's mocking Joe Biden, who is a racist, but he's presidential, and that's common. Why people are backing Joe because he's presidential. This is a prejudicial. This book, I mean, is very well written. It's just a few chapters. It's like a chapter on each president. Goes through all the presidents, even up the current day. Um, I mean, this book is kind of easy to write because it's simply it's good work, but it's easy to write because all the presidents of the United States are products of this imperialist racist system, and the narrative isn't even talked about in schools. It seems like the more poor a school is, the more jingoist propaganda is given to the students, and the richer schools are allowed a little bit more critical thinking on historical issues. But it's just mindless garbage, that George Washington never lied, and Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, which is true, was a coalition, including Marxists behind him. But I mean, even Abraham Lincoln, there's a story on this where was racist. But this is a good resource, especially me coming from a largely historical perspective. But I'm talking about media in general. Black Agenda Report is a great media source from the oppressed Afro American nation, or the oppressed African nation within the United States, however you want to look at it. And then we got Telejaguar, which is from a Chicano nationalist perspective. So back to, I mentioned Telejaguar. One of their journalists, Karena Akri Paez, I believe, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, recently wrote an article that was similar to an article from Black Agenda Report, and it was called "Survive on $1,200 for 10 weeks. The virus is corporate oligarchy." Another article that came out this week from the Black Agenda Report, from the executive editor, Glenn Ford, "The American Disease. Only the overthrow of the oligarchy will cure it." That's powerful anti-imperialist journalism. Two positive sources. Speaking of Telejaguar, the poet Matt Cedillo, his book "Mowing Leaves of Grass," a great poem. He's actually, if you want to look up Matt Cedillo, you can find him on the Telejaguar website. Find him on Facebook. He's doing a live from Facebook this week, I believe on Monday, which he's doing with a professor studying capital and applying it to the Chicano nationalist perspective. This Monday, he applied Marx's concept of primitive accumulation, which was when the capitalist took the common grounds from the peasants, specifically the English, were took from the Scottish. And he applies that concept of primitive accumulation to Aslan in the Southwest in the United States. And basically, that's primitive accumulation. And it was actually Scottish people and English, the Anglos in general, that stole the indigenous communal resources from the people and proletarianized them. And then apply that to NAFTA, where the hard-fought won resources, the agricultural collectivization under Zapata, one of the Mexican Revolution, one of the most strong, I believe, the first large-scale socialist revolution in the world, the Mexican Revolution, 7 years before the Russian Revolution, collectivized their land. And then 1994, when cheap monetized GMO corn, all the same seeds, invaded basically and put southern indigenous farmers from Mexico off their lands, which they won in the revolution, going back to 1910. This is all primitive accumulation. So Matt Cedillo, and I believe a professor, if you look up Matt Cedillo on Facebook, I believe this Monday he's continued his talk about capital. Shout out to Kamar Shaw. What's up, brother? How's it going? Anybody watching this want to get on live, do comments? That's great. All right, so I recommend everyone get on and follow Matt Cedillo on Facebook. He's doing a study on Marx's Capital and largely applying it to Mexican-American, Chicano perspective. So as I was saying, that was a really brilliant idea. And you can apply Marx's concept of primitive accumulation to what happened to my neighbors, Mexican immigrants who came in the 90s. They were dispossessed of their lands, going back to peasant times. I mean, and they were forced into becoming workers, the same process that happened to European peasants earlier on. So we're talking about positive media. More positive anti-imperialist media you can find. Cindy Sheehan's Soapbox, the organization March on the Pentagon. I recommend everyone go look up their recent Women's Day conference, International Working Women's Day. They had a forum. They had the leader of Mint Press, which is another good U.S. media source. I recommend everyone go check that out. Another one, Abby Martin's Empire Files, from a strong anti-imperialist perspective. There's a video, it's going around on Facebook, of like a video source, Soapbox. This is a good one. And then we can look into anti-imperialist countries' media, Telesur, RT, Chinese media. Like even these have a way better perspective. People might tell me, why would you back RT, or which is a capitalist country, or why would you back Chinese media? These are big empire. These are also empires. These are also capitalist countries. But the premise is the greatest enemy of humanity is is imperialism, led by U.S. imperialism. Greatest, no one has the bases all over the world like U.S. empire. No one carry out as much coups. No one controls the global narrative as much as U.S. imperialism. So any perspective outside of this power source, RT, Chinese media, Telesur, are better media sources than the U.S. media sources, including Democracy Now!, NPR, and so-called liberal sources. So that's a short introduction into U.S. media, sporadic short introduction. I'm going to go into a few sporadic current events. The big thing that's going on right now, as people are being laid off, people are told to stay home, people are losing their jobs. I'll talk since I'm talking about the media. People might say, why do you as a communist read the Wall Street Journal? And the question is pretty easy. If you go back to my quote earlier, or what I was saying about the schools, it seems like the media consumed by the working class and oppressed nations in the United States is the most strong, jingoist, mindless stuff supporting U.S. imperialism. And then as you go up, if you get into a better school, they might teach a little bit of imperialist thinking. The same is true with the Wall Street Journal. If you read your local paper, it's completely controlled by right-wing reactionary news organizations. But if you look at the Wall Street Journal, it's different from an imperialist slant because they're a little bit less worried about people who read the Wall Street Journal and joining Marxist socialist organizations and hoping to overthrow imperialism. But the big thing that happened right on yesterday's headline, U.S. jobless claim hits 6.6 million. There's a graph going around, and it's showing the jobless claims, and it starts down here and it goes up and down, and there's a little bit of a crash, and then it almost starts going down under Trump's inflation of the market, and then boom, higher than it's ever been within just within days. I mean, at this point, we should take the coronavirus seriously. But the long-lasting economic effects on the working class coming from another recession or even another depression are going to be far worse than what the coronavirus is going to do. And if you look at, I mentioned Glenn Ford's article, which I'm going to repeat the title again, if I can find my notes. Glenn Ford's article, The American Disease, Only the Overthrow of the Oligarchy Will Cure It. In that article, he talks about how the crash, the 2008 crash, was like a poison or a toxin that invaded and hurt the entire global economy and hurt workers all over the world. So another crash, which was due because Trump's artificial inflation, tax cuts, which companies didn't hire people with, they simply bought back their stock and then inflated the price. So there was going to be a soon fall anyway. And there's a fall, I will state this again, there's a fall every 7 to 10 years in capitalism because of something called the crisis of overproduction. Google that, look more into that, which essentially means workers cannot buy back what they produce because the capitalists need a profit. Therefore, the price of what we produce is always less than our wages because of the profits extorted by the capitalist class. Causes overproduction, causes crashes. The current crash, as shown in the Wall Street Journal, U.S. jobless claims hit 6.6 million. This is going to have long-lasting effects. This has already thrown the little retail industry is basically destroyed. People are relying more on online. They'll probably continue to rely more online. It exacerbates the idea of automation. Something that was mentioned, I mentioned Matt Cedillo's live study of Marx, and he mentioned something interesting in there as well. He talked about how that Reagan, I don't remember which president he compared him to, maybe Carter, someone before that. He talked about how Reagan, it wasn't because Reagan was some kind of evil racist, which he is, but the presidents before him, Nixon, let's go into Nixon. I think Matt Cedillo compared Nixon to Reagan and their analysis of capital. And basically what they were saying is, it wasn't that Reagan was so much more racist and horrible than Nixon. It was because of automation that Reagan was able to destroy the unions. This is scientific understanding. And because automation was making the workers less necessary, that is why Reagan was able to destroy the movements. Nixon, actually, the so-called hard hatters, which he used as reactionary, which he actually propped up, created it was in U.S. imperialist interest to build up the labor aristocracy. And there was a certain bit of union workers which were reactionary and racist, would go around beating up communists and stuff. But essentially the idea I'm getting from Matt Cedillo is it's the mechanism, the real machine, not just the theoretical machine, but the actual machines, the physical infrastructure, the physical conditions that allow U.S. imperialism to do what it can do, which was the automation led to the power of Reagan being able to destroy the unions. So continued automation in the gig economy is destroying jobs. And now we have another economic crisis. Like I said earlier, I support mutual aid. I've seen positive quality work from Black Panthers, New African Black Panther Party, United Panthers, even some from Black Hammer, doing mutual aid, going out, talk to your neighbors, coming together. I talked about it in my last episode. Essentially, the point I made last week, the U.S. government is simply there to maintain the profits and maintain the system of imperialism. As I said from Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital, where we're simply maintained as a race, not an individual, not as individuals. They don't mind if thousands of us die, or even millions of us die, or millions of us struggle. As long as we're maintained enough where they need us to continue the machines running, to build up their profits and keep their empire going, they don't care about us. We're an afterthought. The main premise of this government is to protect profits. And you can see that they bailed out Wall Street, they bailed out the banks, and us, the working class, we're losing our small businesses, we're losing our jobs. I'm going to quote the name of Karena Akri-Barez's article again, $12,000 for 10 weeks. The virus is corporate oligarchy. Such a great headline for a great article. All right. The economy is going to, like Wall Street is going to come back, but we are still going to be left. Like we lost Are we lost material conditions? Like if you look at the material conditions from the 2000, like before the 2008 2009 recession to now, we're still not as good. Specifically, young people and millennials, we don't have it nearly as good as our parents do. And now another recession is going to just make this problem worse. All right, so I'm in my current event section. Next one is something I heard on Democracy Now!, and this is just how horrible capitalism, imperialism, meeting up with the coronavirus, and some of just the weird effects that are happening in this country. U.S. prisoners in New York are being paid $6 an hour to dig mass graves. I'll repeat that again. Prisoners in New York City are being paid $6 an hour to dig mass graves. Like that just conjures all kinds of historical and political issues. Like if you read, I think it's the 13th Amendment, it says everyone has rights unless they are criminalized, then you don't no longer have any rights. So this idea of the new Jim Crow, which is essentially over policing of Black communities and communities of color and the working class in general, they're able to take people's rights away. They're able to take people's ability to be employed. They can discriminate legally against these communities if they're criminalized. And it goes all the way back to like American folk heroes. John Henry, African American, strong, powerful, proletarian worker. I think it was NPR special or something where I was listening, and there's good reason to believe that John Henry was prison labor, building the railroads, and he was buried in a nameless, unmarked grave after being worked to death somewhere in DC. That just conjures up the image of mostly people of color and the poor who are criminalized against, are being paid less than minimum wage, slave wages, to dig mass graves of the people dying because this government wanted profits, purposely did not take the test that could easily test people to figure out and fix the situation. They wanted to make sure U.S. companies made profits, which killed these people that being dug mass graves for by workers who have less rights because they're criminalized against, because the racist classist system of the new Jim Crow. Also, as a truck driver, a really shocking image I saw within the coronavirus was refrigerated with dead bodies being put in the refrigerated trucks. I mean, I drove van for a number of years. Just think about what if that was a driver's first load. People from rural communities, we ain't got no jobs, so we're forced to be away from our families. Just to maybe almost enter the middle class, maybe try to own our own home at one point in time. So that truck driver got to drive dead bodies in a refrigerated truck, just like the prisoners paid $6 an hour to build mass graves. It comes down to it, this idea of the essential worker that they're saying. The essential worker is the proletariat. We're the ones we're the ones that keep this country running on a daily basis. Without us, there are nothing. We're the ones that make the food for people. We're the ones that transport the goods around this country. Everyone in this country that has anything has it because work. All wealth is created by the working class. But we are put out, not allowed decent housing conditions, not given basic human rights, criminalized. The undocumented community, NAFTA destroyed their economy, particularly Mexican immigrants. U.S. imperialism destroyed the political systems and impoverished Central America and Latin America. People forced here without papers to work for slave wages that feed us in this country. We're forced to continue the system running. They do not care about our health. They don't care if we get corona. The millionaires and the billionaires are out on yachts at sea with their wealth all around them to wait out the coronavirus. And we have to continue to work and to feed people at risk with no hazard pay. This coronavirus shows the emperor has no clothes on to the working people. It's revolutionary rising people. Get Marx. The people who are becoming unemployed, we should be building unemployed councils. We should be spreading Marx and the ideas of Marxism to our neighbors that are going through joblessness, being exploited in their work. As this crisis shows the absolute evil of the system, the capitalist system, the imperialist system, the racist system, the oppressive system towards oppressed nations. All right. So another thing that happened that was interesting was one of the people who carry out these imperialist aggressions, a captain of the Navy, was actually reprimanded, I believe fired or reprimanded, for being a whistleblower, that hundreds of people in the Navy were basically in small quarters and being forced to spread the virus amongst each other. And the Navy's like, we got to get this ship home. And then he was fired because U.S. imperialism doesn't care about those working class soldiers, about those working class seamen. They don't care if they die as long as imperialism is continued. So they don't even care about their own soldiers, let alone the people they're oppressing. And let's compare that whistleblower who was fired to these lies against the Chinese people, against one of the most the strongest economic on earth that's pushing the world towards socialism. If you read the media, they say, "Oh, China knew about the crisis and they reprimanded the whistleblower." But if you compare what they did to the Navy whistleblower, who immediately fired him, who may have leaked stuff to the public, didn't even leak. So if he leaks stuff to the public, I understand. Governments need to be able to control, have a little bit of idea. They can't let fear-mongering run rampant. So if the Navy captain would have went directly to the public and said this, I mean, I could see that. Maybe they could reprimand. But he didn't even go directly to the public. There's no evidence of this. Somehow his letter to management got leaked. But in the case of the so-called whistleblower in China, he was going to say exactly what the Chinese government was going to say several hours after he said it. But he decided to go directly to the media and say it, and he was reprimanded. But the U.S. government, not the Chinese government came out and said this. And look at the Chinese response. Chinese response was decisive, automatic, quarantine, had trucks ready to come in and feed people. Compared to the U.S. response, couldn't get the right test kits. People are dying. Workers are forced to work. Prisoners are forced to dig mass graves. Truck drivers have to carry bodies in refrigerated trucks. It's two completely different systems. Xi Jinping, if you read his writings, is trying to get a moderately prosperous society, take people towards socialism. And their policies are written actually to help working people. In the United States, our policies are wholly and unequivocally written simply to maintain profits and maintain imperialist hegemony. Talking about the Navy. So we've all been looking at what's going on in what the U.S. government is doing against the popular leader Maduro in Venezuela. I'm just going to repeat my quick points on Venezuela. Venezuela has a constitution written and approved by the masses of black, brown, and indigenous people and poor people, have a constitution written and approved by them, as compared to the U.S. Constitution written by slaveholders, by like Thomas Jefferson, who raped his slaves and kept his own children as slaves, who have used Venezuela has used petro-socialism to fund art projects, to give basic food co-ops. They have built over 1 million houses to give to the poor. They're being brutally attacked because they do not fit in to U.S. imperialist hegemony. So recently I stated that U.S. empire called Maduro a narco-terrorist and put a price out, a hit out on his head. This is unprecedented. The U.S. empire has put out an illegal hit on another popular elected leader's head. And now there's military buildup, including the Navy, which they don't care about. U.S. workers, which they don't care about, are being used to intimidate the Venezuelan people. And now there's military buildup around Venezuela. And at the same point, and this is interesting because at the same point, there was actually a swell in oil prices. Oil prices leaped 25% as Trump expects a Saudi-Russian deal. So all the many prices go down. Prices are going up. Now they called Maduro a narco-terrorist. They put a price out at his head. And now they have Navy vessels near Venezuela. Like simply, like if you look back when they killed Soleimani, the U.S. viciously killed someone on a peace mission. Soleimani, the person who was actually leading the fight against terrorism in Iraq, a state diplomat from Iran. That was enough. When that happened, just the threat of war can temporarily increase oil prices, giving the U.S. banks and oil companies, the oligarchs that control this country, massive profits. Just the threat of a war with Venezuela is raising profits for the U.S. oligarchs. So I talk a little bit about the U.S. media. I went over a few current events. I'm going to get to my conclusion. I think we need an international united front, similar to what the Soviet Union, United States was to oppose the Nazis. Liberals and leftists coming together to destroy one of the most destructive powers on earth, the Nazis. I think we need a new united front. The new greatest purveyor of violence, as Martin Luther King said. The biggest military in the world. Most intrusive, coup-doing, soft power, election rigging is imperialism led by U.S. imperialism. We needed a united front to destroy the U.S. oligarchs in the United States, which are the most oppressive, destructive force on earth. This includes allies in the Chinese government. This includes allies in the Russian government. I'm going to talk about Russia. Russia is a capitalist country. But in the sole fact that they have nationalized their oil and are using those profits to help Russians makes them more of an ally than our own government, where it is private individuals, banking and oil cartels who control almost all aspects of our society. They're a far greater enemy of us. Our own government and the oil and banking cartel that control this country are a far greater enemy to us than the Russian government, and especially the Russian people. So in this anti-imperialist united front, the Russia government is an ally. The Chinese government is an ally. Hugo Maduro, the successor of Hugo Chavez, is an ally. The Nicaraguans are an ally. And we need to, any mobilization in this country, in the oppressed nations, and in the working class in general, should be in solidarity with all anti-imperialist forces around the world. I think that's going to do it for today. All power to the people. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.